plutonium, which would change everything. Now, what Israel has done is tell the world that the key to preventing the nuclearization of Iran that could have worked is a credible military threat. That ironically, the way to avoid military action is to have a military threat. And the world never accepted it. On Iran, they did on Syria. On Syria, they sort of. Barack Obama threatened Syria for a few days. And thanks in part to that, and really more to the Russians, Syria did agree to remove their chemical weapons. And we in Israel say, excuse me, their chemical weapons killed 1,500 people. Your conventional weapons have killed 115,000 people. And it makes us worried in Israel that in a country where there's no oil, the world isn't going to do anything to stop it. Then there's Hezbollah in Lebanon that has somewhere between 70 and 80,000 rockets aimed at us today. Then there's Egypt. Unlike Hezbollah, that's become part of the government in Lebanon, making the government in Lebanon much worse, the government in Egypt is much better. And what does the world led by America do? Cut off their funding. Take away their money. Then there's what's going on with Gaza, the horrible tunnel that was revealed 3 weeks ago now, that went from Gaza to a kibbutz kindergarten. When I think of a tunnel, I think of something my dog would dig up, but this was a 6-foot tall tunnel made with Israeli cement and $10 million of the world's money that was intended to feed their people. The electricity and everything. And Israel, when it destroyed the tunnel, 4 soldiers were hurt. And this tunnel, of course, was intended to kidnap Israeli children and hold them for ransom. Then there's what's going on with the rest of the Palestinians. And we are technically talking to them when only 9% of Israelis believe that there's any potential of a deal happening there. And according to a poll of Palestinians, by the Palestinian Center for Public Opinion, 58% said that if there is no deal in these talks, it will lead to a third intifada. Okay, are we depressed enough yet? Do I sound like the most optimistic man in this room? So now let's go through what's happening again, through those same countries again. I've got my, with all due respect, I've got my low tech over here, with my mouth. This helps because you can't use that when you speak on Shabbos. doesn't matter how much technology you have, that's useless. I can use this. Back we go to Iran. And Iran is reeling. Iran is desperate. And that's why they elected Rouhani, who campaigned on a promise that he could fool the world, as he did back in 2003, when the only time Iran ever stopped a nuclear program was when the United States invaded Iraq, and Iran thought we must be next. And so they stopped their nuclear program until their nuclear negotiator at the time said that he thinks he could get away with restarting the program and the world won't stop him. His name was Rouhani. And so that's why the Ayatollah allowed someone like him, who in Iran is a relative moderate. I hate to see the papers in America that they call Rouhani a moderate and Netanyahu a hardliner. Come on. But everything is relative in the Middle East, and so the very fact that the Ayatollah allowed him to win the election shows how desperate things had gotten because of the sanctions. They've lost $160 billion in the last 2 years. 25% unemployment, 40% inflation, negative 5.5% economic growth, if you can call that growth. And that's why the talks that are going on in Geneva are the exact opposite that they used to be. Remember that it used to be Israel saying, make a deal as soon as you can, and Iran was stalling? Didn't that seem like yesterday? It was like a few months ago. Now it's the exact opposite, where Iran is trying to make a deal. And Israel is telling the world, hold your horses. You'll get a better deal later on, when Iran is on the brink of economic collapse. Had the Obama administration allowed the Senate to pass the last sanctions that could end all the loopholes preventing, that still allow Iran to sell oil and gas to the world, that could finish them off. But they're not letting, the administration is not letting those final sanctions pass. They're not letting them come to a vote. Of course they would pass if they were brought to a vote. They passed in the House 400 to 20. And the only reason they did not come to the Senate is that they had a long recess, longer than the House. It would have happened a few months ago. It was just by chance that it didn't happen. Things would have been a lot better right now in the talks had they just hurried up the legislation a little bit more in the Senate back then, or a little bit more in the House, because it has to pass in the House before the Senate. And so there is still hope that things will get better on Iran, that the pressure during these 10 days, the next talks are going to be November 20th. Between now and then, there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure on the P5+1, on these countries that negotiate with Iran. And someone was telling me a few minutes ago, Israel has no leverage. Yeah, well, the Saudis do. And they're doing the work. You know, they can say certain things that we can't say in Israel. And Netanyahu has been more blunt over the last few days in criticizing Kerry. But there were certain things he wanted to say that his advisors prevented him from saying. Connecting to Kristallnacht, what's going on in Geneva. Today is the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht. Netanyahu didn't say that. He couldn't. He's not burning bridges. He's being critical. But the Saudis, they can burn bridges. They can afford to do it. And so they're going to be throwing their weight, as will other Sunni countries in the Middle East that are terrified of Iran. And we'll see what happens on November 20th. Look, Iran is going to have to come with a better deal. And then if there's no deal then, they'll have to come with an even better deal. Eventually, hopefully, whatever deal will be reached, and it's pretty obvious that a deal will be reached, will be a deal that can be good enough from Israel's perspective. Catherine Ashton promised Netanyahu in a meeting before I came on this trip 3 weeks ago, she said, I will not make any deal with Iran that Israel will find unacceptable. We'll see. Now, meanwhile, Israel knows it has to be ready. You know, if Netanyahu wanted to attack Iran, he would have done it a long time ago. Israel attacked the reactors in Syria and in Iraq before anyone knew they existed around the world. We didn't talk about them. Now we're talking ad nauseum, and that shows that Israel does not want to attack. And so, meanwhile though, we have to be ready. Because being Israeli is about hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. And that's why we had 2 weeks ago a drill of the Air Force drilling, attacking Iran. Of course, they went in the other direction, just in case. They didn't want anybody to get the wrong idea. Practice refueling in the air. And defensively, we're ready too. When I talked to Israeli security officials and asked them what's the most important thing to tell Israel supporters in Long Island, they said, make sure they know that if, God forbid, there is a military strike, it's not World War III. Stop using those words. That Iran's capability is exaggerated, their missiles, I mean, they tested more today, but their missiles, they don't have a serious amount of them in Iran. They're not accurate, and the ones that are can be shot down by the aero missile defense system that we have, most of them anyway. So the damage that they can do is minimal. And they asked, but what about Hezbollah? Well, Hezbollah has 70,000 rockets aimed at us. They said, well, it's no longer a foregone conclusion that Hezbollah would be involved in retaliation against Israel. Hezbollah is part of the government now in Lebanon. And because of that, they have a greater responsibility. And they know that unlike the past war, when Hezbollah attacked Israel, Israel responded only to Hezbollah, not to the rest of Lebanon. This time they're part of the Lebanese government, everything is fair game. And the Lebanese would blame Hezbollah for what Israel would do. And then they would lose power, and they worked really hard to get to power. Why would they risk that for their Iranian former patrons who don't have any money anymore? It just doesn't make sense. And so it's no longer a foregone conclusion that Hezbollah would be involved. Hezbollah is being hit very hard in Syria, where they've become embroiled. And those same jihadist groups there in Syria that are attacking them have purposely spread the fighting into Lebanon and are attacking Hezbollah over there too. So Hezbollah is actually going through a very tough time. Now, as for Syria, well, you know, it is terrible that the world hasn't done anything about the conventional weapons, only about the chemical weapons. But first of all, the chemical weapons, we really appreciate that they're being removed. I mean, we're talking 1,200 tons of chemical weapons that have been stockpiled there in Syria to use against us, not to use against their people, even though they did at one time. When people stockpile poison gas to use against the Jewish people, we have to take it very seriously. And the fact that it's being removed, seriously, we really have to appreciate that. And as for the conventional weapons, well, there is one country that has taken steps to remove the overwhelming majority of the conventional weapons in Syria. That country is Syria. You know, Syria has wasted their conventional weapons on their own people. They had those conventional weapons to use against us. According to Israeli security officials, what they have left in Syria is 10% of what they had before the war began. I mean, they're empowering 40% of Syria. There's ups and downs, but their actual firepower is only 10% of what they had before. And that's definitely a lot better. Israeli security officials said that had Syria attacked Israel a few years ago, it would have taken Israel about a week to get to Damascus and win the war. He said, now, give us a few hours. Now keep in mind, the IDF was built up over time to be able to defend Israel against the three strongest Arab armies: Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Syria's at 10% of what they had before. Iraq has almost nothing. And Egypt, well, Egypt is our friend. You know, we have a better relationship with this regime in Egypt than we've had in a long time. We have a better relationship with this Egyptian regime than we've had with the government in Egypt since Moses was a boy. And we're cooperating very closely with this Egyptian military government that took power in July in a coup that I can tell you the Israelis who briefed me before my last trip in March predicted everything to the letter about what would happen there a few months later. I was so impressed when I went back and read my notes. As opposed to the last coup in Egypt before, that Israeli military intelligence was caught completely and very publicly off guard. So this Egyptian regime not only has a good relationship with Egypt, the people with Israel, the people in Egypt know. The military controls the newspapers there in Egypt, and on their front pages they reported that when America cut off their funding, I mean they didn't really cut off their funding, they provided the funding and then a month later said they were cutting it off, but they give it twice a year, so they didn't really cut off their funding, they only said they would. And them cutting off their funding was enough to get the Saudis to come in and say, we're going to give you now $12 billion to make up for the funding that America didn't actually cut, but they said they would. So the Egyptian papers reported that when America announced they were cutting off their funding, it was Israel that was lobbying America to save them, and other countries around the world too. Now keep in mind, the Egyptian papers, they know how to be anti-Israel. Remember the Mossad sharks that we supposedly sent to the beaches there to attack the Egyptians? You know, I have a friend who used to work with me at the Jerusalem Post, and now is based most of the year in Cairo. She works now, she got too cool for us, she works for BuzzFeed, you know what that is?